Go ahead, Jeremy.
All right, thanks. So at today's office hours, I wanted to uh, start a conversation about the use cases people have for the agents that they're deploying in Voltron. Um, it, it's good to know in general, but then in specific, we're looking at um, uh, restricting who can access an agent's configuration store. And there's numerous use cases around what agents might want to do with configuration stores. And so I just wanted to see if people are, uh, what people's thoughts around that are, if they're using the configuration store or if they um, have plans to, or what do people envision using it, and then we can talk about how we're securing it and how those two fit together. Maybe we should start off by just with a refresher about what the configuration store is. Kyle, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, sure. So the configuration store is a feature of the platform that allows agents to be configured dynamically. In order for an agent to support the config store, there are some code changes that need to be made, and supporting the config store can be a little bit more complicated depending on the agent than just supporting the traditional packed-in configuration. But at a high level, an agent basically sets up a callback function that responds to changes to its configuration, and then whenever a configuration change is made on the platform informs the agent of the change, and then the base agent will call the your code to implement the changes. The difficulty of changing your configuration at runtime is it's a per agent problem, and there's most agents it's pretty simple. Some of the more complicated agents, some thought has to go into it. But that's the configuration store at a high level. So if you've set up the master driver in any version of Voltron since 4.0, you've worked with the config store. And then so that you know that when the master driver is started, when you put new configurations for new devices, those configurations are picked up immediately by the master driver, and the new driver is activated. Likewise, if you remove a configuration, it shuts down the driver automatically. Um, the configuration store has a command line interface that handles three different formats of configuration file. It can handle CSV files, JSON files, and then just raw data files. It will parse those automatically and present them to the agent in a consistent format. One configuration can reference the contents of another configuration. Again, if you've worked with the setting up the master driver, you've done this when you reference a registry file from the driver configuration file. But all of those features are available to any agent that wants to set them up. So what we want to talk about today is how we plan to secure the config store, possible use cases for the config store, such as one agent wanting to modify the configuration of another agent, what we should allow and shouldn't allow, and how we are going to secure that. So the first thing that everybody needs to know about securing the config store is currently the config store is completely unsecured. The I won't get into like specific things that you can do if you understand how the back end works right now. Things that will be fixed shortly, or will be fixed in a future version of Voltron. But on the front end, there is an interface to the config store for managing the config store. And currently, if you know the RPC, the names of the RPC methods, any agent can just call that management interface and change the configuration of another agent, which if you trust all the agents on your platform, that can be very convenient. but from a security standpoint, that's not very good. The other way that configurations can be modified is there's an interface through the agent itself to modify its own configurations. That is already secure because the config store looks up the identity of the agent doing the call, and that's how it determines which configuration store to modify. But the management interface is still wide open. So we have some plans to restrict who can use the management interface, but we also understand that there's use cases for developing a suite of agents that can modify each other's configurations. And so we want to make sure that those use cases are possible, but we want to talk to the community about how they're going to use the config store to how they might use the config store and how they might use one or more agents to solve a particular problem, and how the configuration store would come into play. And we want to hear from the community so that we can make sure that, because we're developing the specifications right now for securing the config store, and we want to make sure that we don't accidentally put somebody in a situation where their use case is either impossible or very difficult to achieve. So, yeah. So with that, does anyone want to discuss their use cases for the platform in general, for their agents, and how it might affect the config store? Was that a good start, Jeremy?
Yeah. And if, while people are thinking about it, maybe Robert, do you want to start? So ILC has a pretty complex configuration. Are you planning on using a config store for that at all, or is it pretty much once it's set up, you're good to go?
No, we've talked about enabling config store support for the ILC agent.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, it's going to just need to modify its own, right?
That's right.
Could you envision could you envision a use case where, say, AFDD, you have a new version of AFDD where it is going to dynamically figure out how many instances of itself it needs. So, previously there are 7 RTUs, you got 7 copies of AFDD, each individually configured. With the tagging service, you could have it so you have basically a master AFDD or something like that. It detects how many devices are tagged as RTUs, and then spins up, dynamically creates 7 copies of itself in the config store or something like that. Do you think, is that a use case you see yourselves going with at any point?
Potentially.
Okay.
I don't know if we haven't really talked about that in detail. I know that the tagging service is available, and that's one of the functionalities, but
What about the market agent, Chad's old code? There were several agents working together in that. Is there any dynamic configuration part of that now or in the future?
Let me think, because I've been working with.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, the market service is new functionality that will be in beta, and that's making it into 5, right?
Yeah, we can, for the 5 full release, I think we can.
I can definitely see instances where the configuration store could be useful for the market service. I know, as a lot of those agents use like models to do some prediction about how either zones or different components are going to react based on the availability of some commodity and current conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so as time evolves, those modeling parameters can become outdated, and there can be a need to update those.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's some application that's actually looking at those parameters and decides, hey, I need to retrain this model, I can
Yeah.
retrain, I can, ingest the data, retrain the model, and then update.
Update the parameters of another agent.
Yeah, so I can see that as a use case.
Okay. So what Robert is describing is kind of an underutilized aspect of the config store. The actuator agent does this, but I don't know of many other agents that do it, where they use the config store to store state, so that if the agent is shut down and restarted, it just resumes where it's left off. The actuator agent used to do, before the config store, the actuator agent would do this using a file on disk. Now it actually uses the config store to store its current state. So then if you uninstall and reinstall the actuator agent, it doesn't lose its state. Um, uh, so, um, so in this case, though, we're talking about parameters for a particular set of agents that can be managed by a parent agent, and that's that use case is the one that we see as the most obvious and probably the most common use case for agents modifying other agents' configurations.
And so in that case, it'd be kind of a group or a family of agents who
Mm-hmm.
might want to access each other's config store.
Mm-hmm. Either to obtain information about how that agent is configured, or to change its configuration uh, as the circumstances change.
Right. Okay. So what are some ideas about doing that? You could have known identities for the agents, uh, utilize the agent keys, restrict it to based on that maybe, group key or something, or because what you don't necessarily want is you don't want some other agent unrelated to the experiment to, or that group to come in and change something.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about like maybe like kind of like how Linux has different groups that have different permissions, creating like a platform hierarchy of groups that have different permissions to access different functionality?
When there's currently in the platform you can restrict an RPC call to agents that are authorized with certain capabilities. For the config store, we've discussed giving permission, an agent giving permission to another agent to modify its config store. It would require a new interface. It would probably require a new interface in the config store for agents to do this that's not the management interface. That's specifically designed for modifying other agents' configurations and managing those permissions. So yeah, and that was the direction we were leaning, is not quite as fine grained or fancy as what you can do in a Unix operating system, but more of here's a list of agent IDs that can modify my configuration, and then through that interface, if an agent with one of those identities attempts to modify the configuration, it would be allowed to do it.
But what is stopping another agent from just taking that or using that VIP identity?
Um, well,
Do we not authenticate for VIP each agent? If you're using the authentication authorization, each agent has to have its own key, right? So
Right.
what's preventing us from using that key so that to the config store, basically without that agent's key, you're not able to access the config in any way?
Craig is not on the call. He and Chandrika discussed this aspect of it in detail yesterday. But they were talking about certs, and it was a little over my head.
Okay. So we should take an action for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was one of the open questions we had because we were talking about the same, like with respect, like, so for example, like a known identity, like platform historian, like you could uninstall a platform historian and then install a different agent and install that as a platform historian. Now, would should the new agent have access
Well,
to
okay.
the config store? That
Okay. Okay,
that was kind
so
of the contest that we were discussing. It.
yeah, I guess if we're talking about a secure environment, agents are only going to ever be run through the platform, and they must be installed through the platform. And okay, here's something that I forgot about: is when we, as part of implementing the config store, one of the things that was done was we verify that there's no conflicting IDs at agent install time. So, assuming that the agent is packaged and signed correctly and nothing has changed, there's a preferred identity or there's a required identity. Once it's installed, the identity is fixed for an agent. And so, in theory, if the file in the agent installation is part of what's signed, then unless you modify that the file that holds the VIP identity, and then then the agent's no longer valid, you wouldn't be able to run it. And at installation time, we verify that there's no conflicts. So unless you uninstalled the platform historian and installed another agent on top of it, but it would require the administrator to do some. Basically, you would require your platform admin to do something malicious. I think that covers it.
Okay.
So essentially, as long as the platform is secure, or the machine, the access to the machine and the platform,
Yeah.
the config store would be also secure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so as I said, we're in the design part of this.
Yeah.
So if anybody else on this call has thoughts or comments, or would like more examples of using the config store so they can see how it might fit in their use case, let us know. We'll have some follow up in future office hours.
Yeah. The main thrust of this is to make sure that all of the agents that are installed on the platform, that you install on your platform, are going to play nice with each other.
Right. Okay. Well, if there's no comments on that, previously we talked about how we're looking at refactoring the VOLTTRON message bus to make it more flexible, and we're looking at starting a working group for that. Bora, did you want to say a few words?
Yes, thank you. So we are evolving the VOLTTRON message bus, and one person or one company/person has volunteered to help with that, but we could always use more help. So if your companies or your organizations are using VOLTTRON, clearly you're on this call today. If you want to have a say in how we're doing the message bus work, or you have some features that you'd like to see, or your favorite message bus broker that you'd like to see, please let me know. My email is bora@pnnl.gov, and I will make sure that you get included. In Slack, there's a message bus refactor topic in the VOLTTRON or channel in the VOLTTRON community, so you can also subscribe to that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And obviously, this is a big, we're gonna do a scoping study to understand it and see where we want to head with this. And obviously, this is a big refactor, and it'll affect the platform. And so, especially for people who are making use of the platform, we want to make sure that that they're part of this process. So please reach out to us and become involved, and we can start doing some working group meetings. So, all right. And with that, I'll just open the floor up for questions. Are there any topics that other people on the call want to cover? Not hearing any. All right.
Wow, short meeting.
If there's no topics people want to cover, then we can call it. I would encourage people on this call to, if there's a topic you want to have us present or discuss, please send that to us ahead of time, and we'll be more than happy to put that onto the agenda. And as always, we're very interested in hearing what other people are doing with the platform. If you want to present your work, talk about research you're doing or things you're thinking about, that would be great to see. Last time we had Olga talk about a data repository. We've had other people talk about systems that they're working on. So definitely like to encourage people to volunteer for that. All right. If nothing else, then we'll call it a meeting. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.